So hello and welcome to week 2 of Introduction to American Studies. I'm your instructor, Erin Santana. I'm a graduate student here at Rutgers Newark in the American Studies program. And I'll talk a little bit about my work later on in this video, but I did notice that some of you are interested in the education field. I was a teacher in the New York City public schools for many years, and would love to talk to any of you about that if you're interested. I did some counseling social work roles in the schools as well, which I noticed was an interest of some of you. And just more broadly, one of the assignments for this class is to imagine your own hypothetical American Studies research project, which we'll talk about in much more detail later on in the semester. But one of the wonderful things about this field is it's so broad that it can encompass anything that you're interested in, personally or professionally. So I'm excited to see how the various interests and aspirations that you all put down in your surveys can morph or blossom into some really cool projects that we can imagine together this semester. So this week we're going to be talking about just what is this thing called American Studies. So American Studies can perhaps be best understood by what it is not. American Studies is not a discipline, meaning that it does not have specific methods that are associated with it. So historians go to archives, analyze old documents. This is the method, right, the archival method that is used in the discipline of history. Now, anthropologists observe people in various settings and take extensive notes on their observations, and this is the ethnographic method, which is often used in the discipline of anthropology. So historians use archival methods, anthropologists use ethnographic methods. Historians traditionally don't use ethnography, and anthropologists traditionally don't use archives. But in an American Studies program, like ours here at Rutgers Newark, you can use any methods you like from any discipline, as long as they make sense for whatever you're researching. So this is why American Studies is called an interdisciplinary field, because it's a broad field in which you can use methods from multiple disciplines. So I'll use my own work as an example. So before applying to graduate school, I was working in the New York City public school system, and I decided that I was interested in how our understandings of the history of public schools, particularly the New York City public schools, shape the work that goes on in the schools today. So how, as a teacher or a parent or a student, does my understanding of the history of the schools shape my understanding of the schools as they exist today, and my visions for the schools of the future. So, I looked at a lot of different programs. I looked at history programs, I looked at education programs, I looked at anthropology programs, sociology programs, and they each seemed too limiting. But finally, I found this magical thing called American Studies, which I had never heard of before. So, in an American Studies program, I can use historical methods, right, to study the history of the public school system, but then I can use anthropological methods to study how people engage with that history in the present. I can also work with sociologists who study urban education, lawyers, political scientists, education scholars more broadly. So there are no rules, no limits, and no one has ever told me you can't do it like that. There are plenty of other interdisciplinary fields, so usually they have studies in their name. urban studies, Puerto Rican studies, women's and gender studies, as just a few examples. So American studies is very similar to these fields, and many of the scholarship that we'll be reading was written by folks with degrees in these other areas. The difference is simply that American studies deals with this thing called America. So if you want to study Chinese music, you wouldn't do that in an American studies program. But if you wanted to study the influence of Chinese music on the United States, then that could be a great American studies project. Or if you wanted to study how Chinese music talks about America or the United States, that also could be a cool American studies project. So it doesn't have to be something that took place physically in the United States, right, for it to have to do with America and therefore be relevant to American studies, which we'll talk about a bit later. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, one of your big projects will be coming up with a hypothetical American studies project, and you should start thinking about what topic you might want to study. And the point is that it could be almost anything, whether you're interested in medicine or finance or video gaming or art history. You just have to relate it somehow to America. So originally, the field of American studies was very committed to furthering the idea of American exceptionalism, meaning that scholars were looking for what makes the United States the greatest country in the world, right? That's the idea of American exceptionalism, that the United States is some distinctive, superior country. Thankfully, the Civil Rights Movement put an end to much of that arrogance, and American studies scholars started in around the 1960s to look for more nuanced stories about what is both great and not so great about the United States and everything in between. The field has also been transformed by the women's and queer liberation movements, particularly by incorporating Black and Third World feminist theory. Now, we won't go super in-depth into this semester, although I know some of you are taking classes where you might go into it in more detail, and that's great. I'd love if you can bring some of that learning to our class as well. But we will be exploring two specific aspects of feminist theory which have transformed American studies and which have also been quite transformational in social movements, popular social movements as well. So this is part of the reason why I wanted to cover these concepts, because they're not just relevant to the sort of academic world, but are used, right, more broadly. And so these two concepts are intersectionality and transnationalism. So basically the big three things we'll be learning about this semester are what is American studies, and then what is intersectionality and transnationalism, and how are those related. So we'll look much more into these two other concepts in units 2 and 3. But the basic idea is that people and nations are deeply interconnected in ways that cannot be defined by a single aspect of their experience or a single nation state. So to go into that a little more detail, intersectionality refers to the multiple forms of discrimination that people experience based on race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. So initially, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and we'll be actually watching a video of hers in a few weeks, she came up with this concept of intersectionality to draw attention to the fact that discrimination laws assumed that if a company was discriminating against Black people, that included men and women, all Black people, or if a company was discriminating against women, that included Black women, white women, women of any other racial background. So there was sort of racial discrimination and there was gender discrimination, and those were considered just two sort of separate, distinct things. But in reality, in many companies, black men and white women were both being treated better than black women. And so black women needed to be able to claim the specific forms of discrimination they experienced as black women, right? So the intersection of discrimination based on race and based on gender. So this concept started out in the legal field, but has been widely adopted in American studies and other interdisciplinary studies fields, and it's been elaborated beyond just race and gender. So a classic example of how this has changed scholarship is in Black history, where traditionally, even though scholars were drawing attention to anti-black racial discrimination by covering Black history, when they said Black history, they were mostly talking about middle-class, straight, black men's history, right? The unstated other, right, aspects of discrimination that are not necessarily being explicitly addressed. And so they were often ignoring the particular histories of black women, black queer people, black poor people, etc. So, right, again, intersectionality draws our attention to the fact that when we say black, just as an example, because it comes out of black feminist theory, that category, right, based only on race, does not in and of itself account for the broad experiences of people who experience a variety of other forms of discrimination in addition, right, to racial discrimination. So I decided to focus on this concept in the course, not only because it's become so central to American Studies scholarship, but also because it's become central to popular social movements like Black Lives Matter. So the founders of Black Lives Matter, of the Black Lives Matter movement, identify as black, as women, and as queer. And they talk a lot about how important it is for Black Lives Matter to be an intersectional movement, which means that it's a movement that recognizes the many different ways that black people experience the criminal justice system, depending on their gender, on their sexuality, on their immigration status, class, etc. So the hashtag Say Her Name campaign is a good example of a manifestation of an intersectional, right, movement where folks are drawing attention to the fact that black women specifically who are murdered by the police are often not at the center, right, of these movements historically. So anyway, in Unit 2, we will be reading 3 examples of intersectional scholarship, and we'll be thinking about how this concept manifests in popular media and culture. And then you'll be thinking about how you might apply an intersectional lens to your own hypothetical research project. Then talking about transnationalism, that is the idea that social, political, and economic systems transcend national boundaries. So again, women led the way here, and transnational feminists in the 1970s started to argue that women all over the world needed to join forces to analyze how women are oppressed globally. So for example, if we think about migrant domestic workers, these are women who come from all over the world to the United States to clean other people's houses, to take care of other people's children. And in order to understand, right, the experiences of these women and the various systems that oppress them, we can't just study their experiences in the US, right? We have to study the sort of more global context of where they're coming from and the various political and economic forces, right, that are shaping these sort of flows of migration. So this idea of social movements organizing transnationally then shaped scholarship as well. So for a long time, American Studies scholarship was focused only on the United States, as if other countries didn't exist or impact it. And as I mentioned, actually at the beginning, the early decades of the field, we're talking about sort of 1930s, 40s, 50s, the idea was that America or the United States was indeed superior to all other countries in the world. But more recently, American Studies scholars have taken a transnational approach by looking at how people and goods and ideas travel, right, across and beyond borders, as well as how national borders themselves are created and change over time. Scholars have even challenged the use of the term America to refer to just the United States, while sidelining the rest of the Americas, right? North America, South America. And this is why I almost always put the term America in quotes, and I try not to use it when I'm talking only about the United States for that reason. So in Unit 3, we'll be reading 3 examples of transnational scholarship. We'll be thinking about how this concept manifests in popular media and culture, and you'll be thinking about how you might apply a transnational lens to your own hypothetical research project. So, in summary, the field of American Studies today is very different than when it first came about in the 1920s. Today, American Studies scholars use a variety of disciplinary methods to ask questions about the United States and Americans more broadly, conceived that often incorporate an intersectional approach to discrimination and oppression, as well as a transnational approach to national borders. In general, I found American Studies to be an amazing and fun field to be in because you can ask any research question you want and you can study it however you want, as long as you take seriously the complexities of political, social, and economic power in the United States and in a global context. So next, I want you to read Shelley Fisher Fishkin's article about American Studies in the 21st century. She covers much of what I've just explained in greater detail, and she also shows how women of color feminists, specifically Gloria Anzaldúa and Anna Julia Cooper, as well as the writers and intellectuals W.E.B. Du Bois and Mark Twain, have blazed a trail for us in thinking in these expansive and critical ways. So if you're looking for people to inspire you in this moment, any of these figures would be a great choice. And we'll actually be reading more from Gloria Anzaldúa later in the semester. You will also write your first practice reflection, which will simply be about how this reading challenges or expands your idea or understanding of America and Americans. And you'll find an item of popular media or culture and explain how it relates to the reading. So an example of that might be, Childish Gambino's track and music video, This Is America, from a few years back. So if I had chose that, then in the reflection, I would drop probably like a link to it, and then I would write a few sentences about how, the visuals in the video or the lyrics in the song about the idea of America relate to some of the concepts that Fishkin is talking about in the reading. Also keep in mind that you can always start your reflections by processing how you're feeling this week, if you're looking for a space to do that. And please include any questions or confusions or disagreements that you have with the reading as well. This is scholarly stuff. It can be complex. I think it may be a reach for some folks, but that's part of the reason that I'm providing these videos to kind of help introduce you to the concepts and just encouraging you to just to dig in and really kind of try to wrestle with it. And if there are parts that you don't totally get, that's fine. Try to dig for the parts that you do And we also will have our first optional discussion section this week. Thursday at 7 p.m. was the time that was best for most people, so we'll try that out. And so there'll be no additional lecture or content. It's just a space for you to show up and ask questions. So it's probably best if you do the reading before you show up, so then you can ask any questions you have about the reading. So I'll share a Zoom link to that with everyone. And other than that, your reflection is due Sunday at midnight. And I'll see you next week.